Well, it's 6:30, and I know there's some people watching online, so let's make sure that they get to see this in real time. And I know that, as many of you know, that today, or at least September, is Suicide Prevention Awareness Month, so that's why we're hoping to offer this. We're going to be live streaming each night and then recording it and then putting it on the website. So if you're not able to come for one of the nights, you can come back onto the website during those nights that you're missing, or come on later and be able to access them indefinitely. We don't know exactly how long we'll put them out there, but they'll be on there for a while. So for today, we're going to be looking at the recognize component for this suicide prevention and awareness training. Tomorrow, we're going to be talking about the respond, how we together as a community respond to some of the challenges of having this situation in our lives, and then how we refer people who are struggling with the different conditions, or at least the different mindsets that lead them to contemplate suicide. So a few things before we get started. I have to turn my clicker on. 2 disclaimers. So just to make sure everybody knows what this training is and what it actually will produce for you. The first one is that this does not make you in any way, shape, or form a clinician or a mental health provider. This doesn't give you the ability to do suicide intervention. It prepares you to be somebody that can do prevention and awareness, help people identify some of the things that they're struggling with, speak to those challenges, but it does not make you any sort of a professional in that way. Again, it doesn't make you, at the end of this, you won't get a certificate in suicide intervention, and like I said before, it doesn't make you a mental health provider or a professional. It's intended to prepare you to, not intended to prepare you to be a mental health professional. And if you are interested, though, if you're interested in being able to access some of those intervention trainings, and to build up that skill set inside you, come talk to me afterwards, and I'll be able to point you in a number of different directions to be able to do that. Tonight, what we are is just neighbors coming together as a community, lovingly look at the people around us in our lives, being able to identify family members, friends, colleagues, individuals that we come across that might be struggling with a variety of different issues in their life, that might be venturing down this path that leads them to a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, and then be able to address those things, speak to them, and then guide them towards the appropriate help. That's the idea behind the 3 nights. So the second disclaimer that I have for everybody tonight is to be extremely self-aware. One of the things that's really important when we talk about suicide is that the word itself is traumatic, and so it brings about and evokes a whole myriad of emotions. And so to be able to check in with yourself on a variety of different times throughout the presentations to see how you're doing. Just a couple things. If you have attempted suicide, this prevention workshop might not be for you. You're the best judge for all of those things, and again, this is why you're being self-aware. If you are presently or have experienced suicidal thoughts, this presentation might not be for you. If you have lost someone close to you within the last 3 to 6 months due to suicide, this presentation also might not be for you. Again, like I said before, check in with yourself frequently. Be honest with how you're feeling. There's going to be a lot of different things that were discussed, a lot of maybe triggers for you. Also, there's going to be a video at the end, so just be really honest with yourself and how you're feeling as the night goes on. And then participate in the grounding exercise that we'll be doing as a group towards the end to kind of recenter ourselves at the conclusion. So, like I said, our workshop is based on this evidence-based training as being able to recognize, respond, and refer. Tonight we're going to be focusing solely on the ability or the skill set to recognize. We're going to be looking at a variety of myths that are associated with suicide, what a lot of people say in response to hearing about the news of individuals committing suicide or attempting suicide. We're going to be talking about the facts, looking at the demographics over our country and over our state and over our community and even in our schools, what the statistics are in relationship to all those things, and how alarming it really is. that this is going on around us. So the other thing that we're going to be looking at is risk factors. What are some of the things that put individuals to risk to be able to slip down that slope of helplessness and hopelessness and having that chronic, fatal, emotional and mental pain that leads them to think about suicide as a possible solution to their problems. Another thing that we'll be looking at is the warning signs. Things that you might notice when you're talking to your friends, your neighbors, those in your life that might give you a clue or at least a window or a gateway, a door to be able to see maybe they're contemplating these types of things so that you can identify them, speak to them, and ask the question. And again, that goes to the last thing we'll be talking about is your role. This was kind of a teaser into what our next two nights are going to be, the refer and or the response and the refer, but it gives us just a little taste of what that looks like. Okay, so again, like I said before, when we're talking about suicide, it is a word that brings about a lot of pain, it brings about a lot of fear. It's a word that I know that over the last few years that I've been doing work in prevention and intervention with suicide, that a lot of the different industries actually try to steer away from using it. They maybe try to reinvent the title, right? And being able to just not include it in different documentation or just avoid it altogether, right? Try to reinvent what it is that takes place when someone takes their own life. And the reality is, and the reason why there's a lot of individuals that steer away from the word is just because of the stigma that's associated with it and just the permanence of the word and just the shadow that it casts. And a lot of times the fact that we just don't like talking about it. So we need to make sure that that's what we're doing today is really taking and stripping away a lot of the fear and a lot of the stigma away from the word. So let's talk about some of the myths real quick. The first myth I want to talk about is what you hear a lot, oftentimes right in the wake of somebody committing suicide or attempting suicide. You hear individuals maybe in your life, or maybe you yourself have said it, oh, this is such a selfish decision that they've made. The reality is that when individuals contemplate suicide or try or attempt or carry out this behavior, the things that go through their mind is the fact that they are a burden to society. They feel this. It's a philosophical identity that they have placed on themselves. They honestly believe that they are a burden to everybody in their life. And they believe that they do not belong. And so they are doing this to remove themselves from the situation. You can't get more selfless in that situation. They're not doing it because they think it's the easy way out or any of those types of things. They're doing it because they honestly feel like they are being a burden into other people's lives. So it's the exact opposite of being selfish. And the second one I want to talk about is that suicide people are just looking for attention. That is not true in any way, shape, or form. Now, there's a difference between wanting to be noticed and looking for attention. Individuals oftentimes that find themselves struggling with helplessness and hopelessness, you're going to hear me use those words all the time, but those two things, they drive individuals to feel like they are invisible in the world. Nobody knows them. Nobody recognizes their pain. And honestly, when you talk about people who have attempted suicide, oftentimes they bargain with themselves before they actually carry out the actions. They'll say, if anybody comes to me and says, hey, how are you doing? If anybody smiles at me, if anybody stops me and talks to me before it happens, I'm not going to do it. Which is really sad because oftentimes that doesn't happen in people's lives. A third thing that I want to talk about that is just plain offensive and that I've heard from time to time, especially, it's interesting what we try to say to people in the wake of their loved ones who have committed suicide in an attempt to comfort them. I've actually heard people, friends and family members, tell a close friends and family of individuals who have committed suicide, oh, that person, they must have just been crazy. There's nothing more offensive than that, or they're psycho. These are hurting individuals. These are people that feel like they do not belong in the families, in the society, in the cultures, in the groups They've been intimidated, pushed around, oftentimes abused. They find themselves struggling with drug and alcohol addictions. And for us to just give them this very caustic and offensive label is absolutely inappropriate at best. The next one I want to talk about is that suicidal people want to die. Now, this is an interesting myth. Sometimes people will argue that they do want to die. That's why they're moving in this direction. They have a philosophical or a mentality that tells them that death is the solution or a way of escaping the pain that they're experiencing in their life. It doesn't mean that they've romanticized death and that they want to die. Most people that are suicidal fight the urges of suicide, fight the urges for a period of time before they give in or at least start making preparations for it. There's no romanticism of death itself. It's not something that they are glamorizing. Okay. The next one is that suicidal people are going to hell. I can't tell you how wrong this statement is. This is something that I've constantly been trying to debunk and address when individuals come to me and wonder if their relatives or family members are in hell because they committed suicide, that they took their own life. There's only one thing that places somebody in that situation, and it's not suicide. If you want to talk about that more with me later, by all means, we can have that conversation. But I just want to address that right now, that this is just a myth, and it's hurtful and extremely damaging and spiritually abusive to the survivors of suicide, the family members, and the friends of the individuals that committed it. So we want to make sure that we're not going down that road. With that being said, like I said, if you have any questions, at the end of this, we'll be doing our grounding exercise, and then we'll turn off the live stream and the recording, and then you guys will be able to ask me any questions. We'll do a few questions for about 15, 20 minutes. So if you do have questions, make sure you write them down at the end. We'll address them and answer them. Another myth is that suicide people are weak. The empirical evidence of this is alarming. The fact that individuals who have attempted or followed through, you don't want to use, I hate using the word successful, but have actually taken their own life, is that they aren't weak in the least bit. In fact, they are extremely strong. They've been able to endure mental and emotional and sometimes physical pain for years, and they have a fearless mentality about them. And so there is nothing weak about these individuals. And so there's a huge myth that surrounds that. The last one I want to talk about tonight is the fact that oftentimes people feel that suicide is an impulsive act. This is why, the reason why this is a myth is why what we're doing tonight actually works. Suicide prevention and awareness actually works, and like I said, this is an evidence-based training, because most of the time, suicide is not an impulsive act, and it's not an act done in response to an isolated event or an incident in someone's life. It's something that builds up over time and is compounded by multiple issues over a variety of time. And through the process of months and sometimes years, we are given windows and opportunities to be able to speak to people's pain and their hurt. Now, what suicide does, and that sense of helplessness and hopelessness, is it does give individuals a way of trying to, or it gives them a longing or search for them to try to cope with the pain that they're experiencing. And so sometimes individuals that are dealing with chronic depression or manic depression or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or PTSD, all these other kind of mental issues that we'll be talking about later on tonight. What they'll do is individuals, in order to cope with the pain, they'll run to substances, drugs and alcohol. And what drugs and alcohol does is it lowers their threshold to prevent impulsivity. And so individuals, even though they've been struggling with these pains and this suffering for a long period of time, that those drugs and that alcohol will actually make them less resistant to the impulses that they have. And so it's not that suicidal people are impulsive and that it's an impulsive act. They can act impulsively based on the influence of what they've been using to cope with their pain. I hope that makes sense for you. Okay, so why would anybody do this? So we've gone through, talked about the myths. This is a theory that's been put out and been proven to be correct numerous times, especially even during the pandemic that we've been experiencing over the last few months and a year and a half now. It's brought to us by Tom Joyner. He's a professor at Florida State University in the psychology department. And he said that there's a combination of things that take place. Now, this diagram, it's not going to be the first and only time you're going to see it. I'm going to bring it back multiple times. But he talks about how individuals who feel like they're a burden, you feel like you're a burden, that you aren't contributing, that there is nothing in your life that is giving back, and all you're doing is taking. People feel like you're an inconvenience to them, and so that's a huge component to this. The second thing is the feeling that you don't belong, that something in society or in your family, you feel like you're not wanted, you feel like you're not valued, you feel like you're just not a part of what's happening. And so this idea of disassociating with all of our social circles. Now, you could see how these two things could be really highlighted during a pandemic when we're all isolated and quarantined. And so there's a lot of individuals, especially during our crisis teams, that have been fielding a lot of panic calls and people that are in crisis as they continue to deal with these types of things and have been dealing with these things over the last year and a half. Now, the next component to this is that these two things, the feeling of being a burden and not belonging, when they are connected to a capacity to act. Now, this is really important when we talk about it. Now, I'm not talking about proximity to a means. I'm talking about the actual mentality of taking your own life. This is that concept of being fearless. This is why, going back to that myth about being weak. These individuals that do this are not weak. They are fearless. Because it's a natural human tendency. We all have it in our fight or flight mechanism to protect our life at all costs. These individuals are walking toward that. This is the sense of fearlessness and sense of capacity. So it's a really important thing. Now, what's interesting is, and you'll see it, well, I'll wait till we get to it. I don't want to get too far out into the weeds here. So now that we've talked about myths, now we've talked a little bit about why individuals would get to, or what leads them to this point in their life, we're going to talk about recognizing some of the facts around suicide. So the first thing I want to talk about is the rates of suicide. We're going to be talking about the rates of suicide in America. These figures are presented or given by the CDC as recently as 2020. Some of these statistics that I'm going to be giving you are from 2019, 2020. I don't have any, obviously, of 2021. Don't have a whole lot from 2020 because you can imagine the CDC has been busy with other things in 2019 and 2020. So they're a little backlogged on being able to get some of these more recent statistics. But suicide overall in the United States is the 10th leading cause of death. 10th leading cause of death. So suicide is the second leading cause of death for people 10 to 34. Unintended accidents are number one. Suicide is only eclipsed by unintended accidents for ages 10 to 34. It is the fourth leading cause of death for people 35 to 44, and there are 2.5 times more suicide and this is a statistic from 2019, 2.5 times more death by suicide than homicide in the United States. So when you hear on the news all those people being murdered all over the country, 2.5 times more people are dying by their own hands and their own choices and actions. All of these, whether you're talking about homicide or whether you're talking about suicide, these are preventable deaths. There is no reason why these deaths should be taking place. And it doesn't matter if we're talking about 54,000 individuals or we're talking about one individual. It does not matter. Each one of these people is a human being. They have families, friends, they have loved ones. In their minds, they think that nobody cares about them, but they have loved ones that surround them and would run to them in a minute. So here's a little bit more. This is in 2019. These are the statistics, again, from the CDC. It said that in 2019, 47,500 people died by suicide. That means that there's a death, or at least in 2019, there was one death every 11 minutes by people killing themselves. But see, here's the thing about these statistics on this board, is even if you go over to the other side, 12 million people seriously thought about suicide, 3.5 million people made a plan for suicide, 1.4 million people attempted suicide. These are the cases that are reported. These are individuals that have gone into the hospital, how the emergency room has screened them, and they have been able to actually be logged. This does not take into account the individuals that have attempted it at home, recovered, regretted, that aren't self-reporting. These are the hard numbers that we can actually track. It does not include, I would say by any estimation, what is actually going on, right? So here's a little bit of what's going on. Over the last 20 years, you can see that we've had a gradual increase in the country. No, this is in the state of Minnesota, over the cases of individuals that have completed suicide. So you can say in 2000, there were 440 people that have completed suicide. By 2019, it had almost doubled to 830. It's a gradual increase. There's a decline in 2020. Now, does that alarm or does that confuse anybody? What happened in 2020? COVID happened, right? Why do you think the suicide rate went down in 2020? People, it's interesting, isn't it? How, but now, so the statement was individuals are drawn together. Also, people are more attentive of what's going on. They're checking in with each other because they're not able to talk or be around individuals, so you had a lot more communication and that kind of stuff. Also, that capacity that we go down, that fearlessness. Florida State University has been doing some research to try to figure out what's going on with this, that during the pandemic there was a little bit of a decrease in the suicide rate nationally, not just in Minnesota. And they're saying that that's what happened. That sense of capacity was diminished. Even though individuals felt like they were still a burden and they didn't belong, that sense of belonging kind of was reduced. You know, you had a lot of "we can do this together," all those kind of campaigns that were taking place, but also individuals coming together as family and being kind of, if you will, forced together. Now, what they're seeing in 2021, now I know that if individuals from 411 were here, the crisis lines, they would be telling you they're being inundated by individuals who are contemplating this. We're starting to see a resurgence of a lot of different things. Now, I'm not saying or predicting what the suicide rate's going to be in the coming years, but I do know that as mental health professionals, there's a huge anticipation for a mental health crisis that's going to be coming. Right? So it's something to be very closely monitoring, especially as individuals return back to their life or return back to their life with certain voids in it, like not having a job or dealing with different issues that might have arisen as a result of the pandemic. All right, so that's just kind of a bird's eye view of the state or the rates of suicide in the state of Minnesota. Here I want to talk a little bit about gender, suicide and gender. The first thing is that men have died by suicide 3.63 times more often than females. If you look, regardless of whether you're in Minnesota or whether you're looking at the whole expanse of the United States, men have accomplished this far more. Sometimes people will say even 4.5 or even up to 5 times more likely to die by suicide when attempted than women. But on the same token, women are 1.66 times more likely to attempt it. And we'll talk about why that is as things go, as we go a little bit down. It has mostly to do, I'll just tell you, with the chosen means. Men seem to have a mindset of overdoing things. They don't want to survive these things. And so there seems to be men that choose a lot more fatal means when they're talking about contemplating or carrying out their plans of suicide than women. Women choose oftentimes less fatal means, and that's why you have that disparity. So, one of the things is that we're not talking about anybody's personal beliefs or points of view about the lifestyles of individuals in this study. We want to talk simply about what the statistics are. And so we're talking about gender. I want to talk about the LGBTQ and non-binary adults, because the statistics that are coming out of this particular population group needs to be on our radar. It's extremely important. For instance, the first one is that 41% of all trans adults said they've attempted suicide. It's almost half, okay? The same study found that over half, almost 2/3 of trans people who were victims of physical abuse attempted suicide. These are not individuals that contemplated it. These are people that have attempted it. Conversion therapies and procedures for conversion also add to the risk of depression and suicide. It increases it. So when you're looking out at individuals who are dealing with this particular part of their identity and this aspect of their life, it automatically places them in a higher risk category. Now let's talk about individuals that are youth, right? Youth-based, under 18, that would identify into this category of LGBTQ and non-binary. 40% of that, like I said, of that group, they said they seriously considered attempting suicide in the past 12 months, with more than half transgender and non-binary youth having seriously considered suicide. 68% of that group reported symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder in the past 2 weeks, and including more than 3 and 4 transgender youth and non-binary youth. So almost 70% of them identified having symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder, which leads to depression, which leads to this sense of helplessness and hopelessness. 48%, almost half of this group, the youth reported engaging in self-harm in the past 12 months. This means that they did this in the last 12 months. Over half, right? Or not, just under half. And over half, including 60% of transgender and non-binary youth, reported having done self-harm. Okay? All right. So I know I kind of just went through that one pretty fast. So if we have any questions about that one, can you write it down? We'll talk about it at the end. Okay? We'll talk about it at the end. I'm trying to clip through it a little bit because we got a lot to do today. So here are suicide rates by race and ethnicity. You can see the black line on the top. That black line represents white, Caucasian, non-Hispanic, okay? So you can see the most common individuals that commit suicide are white males, and actually they're white middle-class or white middle-aged males. Well, we'll get to that in just a little bit. The second group, the yellow line, as many of you probably already know, that yellow line, it represents the second highest group, and that second highest group is American Indian. And then dramatically beneath that is Asian Pacific Islander, and the blue line is the black population. Now, this is a little bit, let me see if I have another, yes. When you actually adjust it based on the population, though, because our population is dramatically more white, Caucasian, non-Hispanic. And so when you actually break it down by percentages of those particular populations, the highest affected population for individuals contemplating and carrying out suicide are American Indian. Underneath that, then, is white non-Hispanic. And so, when you think about the different reservations and tribal lands that we have around us, individuals that you might know, seeing that population is extremely high at risk. Okay? And again, why would anybody do this? When we look at, and this, the reason why I'm doing this is because you want to look at this culture and this ethnicity, these groups. These cultures oftentimes lead and promote these categories. You can see that white middle-aged men have fears of being a burden, maybe not being able to make ends meet. They carry a lot of weight. They think that they're not doing a good enough job with their family or at work. They feel like they don't belong. Their social circles are shrinking over time, and they feel isolated. And then the same thing with Native American populations. There's a lot of things in those cultures that lead them to feel this type of hopelessness and helplessness, sense of burden and not belonging, especially in their cultures. And then basically what's leading after that is just the capacity. So let's talk about suicide and age. Suicide and age. I already hinted at it a little bit. The most common age group for individuals that carry out suicide are ages 45 to 64. Now, this has been kind of a recent phenomenon. I think if I'm remembering correctly, it was in the late 2007, 2008, when this age group moved above 65 and older. And you can see the tensions on culture, the pressures of the economic pressures that happen on individuals in this age group. We call them sandwich age groups, right? They're taking care of their kids. They're also taking care of their parents. And so there's a lot more anxiety, a lot more struggle. And so there's a lot of different theories that point to why this was, especially, during that time, 2007, 8, and 9, you had that, what they referred to, I don't know what they officially called it, but I remember it being called the Great Recession, remember? And then you have more things taking place after that. So with the youngest line being 15 to 24. Now, what they've actually done, and I don't have a statistic for this, and I don't have a chart for it as well, but coming out of Florida State University with that Professor Thomas Joyner, he's done work with individuals as young as 3 and 4 years old, identifying suicidal ideation in children that are regarded as toddlers. And it's been able to be documented on what this suicidal ideation, what this mentality looks like as young as 3 and 4 years old. So even though these statistics only go down to 15, we need to understand that suicide isn't just something that happens after puberty. This is this idea of attachment, belonging, of being a burden, that it happens at a very young age. It doesn't just happen when you come of age, in your middle school years or high school. This idea of attachment. I know that some of you might be familiar with some of the ACEs work, adverse childhood experiences, the different measures for those things. And those directly correlate with individuals who feel this idea of a lack of belonging and or being a burden. So in addition to being a burden, this not belonging, not having solid and secure relationships. Okay. Suicide marital status. You guys ready for this one? Let's take a look. So suicide by number. Let's just take a look at that. So if you looked at just suicide by number, the light-colored blue is individuals who are married. So you would think by first glance that the individuals who are married have a higher rate of suicide. But that's not the case. Just like when we were talking about ethnicity, we need to adjust it by population, because the greater number of individuals that are in those high-risk age brackets are more often are married. So we want to look at what it actually is in relationship to the overall population. And so when we actually adjust the suicide rate according to marital status, we're going to be doing it over on the other one that's a suicide by rate, underneath that one. The dark blue section are individuals who have been divorced. So actually, divorced individuals have the highest risk of suicidal ideation and action. Underneath that is, you kind of see they're almost matched, single and divorced. Those are the next two. Single and widowed. Sorry, single and widowed. Single and widowed. So you have single and widowed. Those two groups are very closely related. The lesser group is marriage. And so actually when you do the adjustment, the suicide adjustment, marriage is actually a preventative mechanism for suicide. It's a preventative mechanism for it. Now, of course, I want to say that with a caveat. I'm not saying that marriages that are struggling, marriages that are on the brink of divorce, those things obviously are marriage is not a magic pill for you, right? Individuals that are going through huge relationship strains or relationship transitions, those are things to keep your eyes open because it is it's putting them in a high-risk category. Okay, now let's talk about most common methods. When we look at most common methods, the least common method obviously is other, right? There could be any number of different things inside of this, and we don't necessarily need to break that down. The second from the bottom, 30% in females and 28% in men, is poisoning. Now, I mentioned before that women are 1.6 times more likely to attempt suicide, and men are sometimes 3 to 5 times more likely to die by suicide. And here's the reason why. When one of the main components for individuals that have committed suicide is the immediate regret that they experience. Individuals who do it immediately regret the decision that they've made, and so when individuals use less lethal means, like women that use poisoning, they take the pills, they drink the whatever the solution is, the household solution, they call 911 immediately, right? They have that regret and they have that moment. There's no moment or time for regret with a firearm. And that's where you have with men. 55.6% of the time, men use firearms. And so this is why you see that disparity between individuals that die by suicide and individuals that attempt it. This is also what's really important when you go back to those myths. Suicidal people don't want to die. It's not something they've glamorized, but they see it as the only option for relieving them of their chronic, emotional, mental, fatal pain, right? All right. I'm throwing a lot of numbers at you guys. Here's some resources for you. I think I put them on your worksheet, but if not, I can give them to you later. Lighthouse University, Hope-Focused 3 R's. That's where a lot of the structure is that's come out of this. You can look that up. They do a tremendous amount of work, Light University does. They also have a pair program that you can pay for and go through the training. That is their interventionist training. Some of the statistics came from AFSP, other CDC, and then the National Institute of Mental Health. PSI has a number of suicide interventions. This is where Tom Joyner, where he was doing a lot of his presentations. Save.com and the Trevor Project where those statistics came for the LGBTQ and non-binary people. So I do want to just stop here before we move into the last 2 categories. How's everybody doing? It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose a little bit. I'm trying to cram in a lot of information into an hour for you, but so everybody's doing good? Okay. It's overwhelming? Yeah. Okay. So again, let's just reflect back on this. What is it that leads individuals to contemplate suicide? It's that idea that they are a burden combined with the idea that they don't belong, and then eventually leading to the point over time that they have the capacity to act, this fearlessness that they're going to do this. Right? So, with that in mind, let's recognize the signs. When do we know somebody has gotten to the point where they feel like they're a burden, feel like they don't belong, and they're starting to have that ability to be fearless in the face of their own death? So, we're going to talk about health factors. Maybe there's a situation where they had a recent accident or they had surgery. They're dealing with chronic pain in their body, and they are dealing with it on a regular basis. And this chronic pain is leading them to feel like they're helpless, they're hopeless, they're never going to get better. Things are getting to the point where they just can't do it anymore. This physical pain can metastasize itself into their psyche and their mentality and lead them down paths of depression. Also, when individuals maybe have surgery or they have some sort of chronic pain, perhaps they get involved in using prescription pain medicine. Now, the reason why this is important when we talk about opioid crisis in America is that those types of life behaviors, and we'll talk about it in a little bit when we get to environmental factors, those particular type of life behaviors and those patterns of life that surround addiction, they actually cultivate an idea and put people in a situation where they feel like they do not belong and that they are a burden. And so it will actually put them into that mind state. It's pretty interesting when you start mapping the opioid crisis in America, the trajectory of it, and the suicidal rate as well. So health factors, okay? So individuals being hurt, individuals that perhaps are maybe on medication where the side effects lead to depression. There's a variety of different physical things that might lead somebody to start getting to that point. Another thing is individual factors. Maybe their job is so stressful and they don't have the ability to handle it, the ability to cope with it. They don't have the coping mechanisms set in place. Maybe something happened in their job that all of a sudden increased their stress and their anxiety at work. And they weren't prepared for it. And so that anxiety and stress, it made them spin out of control. And all these things continue to compound. Maybe they missed a mortgage payment in addition to the anxiety that they felt at work. And now they're dealing with that. And then their car broke down. And all these different things keep building up on someone's life, you know. Or maybe it's not just a whole bunch of traumatic things. Maybe it's a lifetime of exposure to traumatic things. We have to think about first responders, individuals that are first on the scene every time. Individuals in emergency rooms that are exposed to trauma and crisis every single day, firefighters, law enforcement, and especially our military personnel. Individuals that have the propensity or at least have professions that oftentimes lead to post-traumatic stress syndrome and other forms of depression. So there's individual factors. Environmental factors, one of the great things that I saw at the school district did this year is they were starting to teach how their teachers can provide and create trauma-free classrooms. The environment that we put ourselves in will actually drive us into different emotional spirals and moods, and oftentimes cultivate the wrong sense or those wrong moods. And so you have individual environments that maybe are oppressive or full of bullying, make people feel like they're not connected, there's no attachment, there's no relationship. You can imagine very dysfunctional or laissez-faire families and parenting styles that lead children or teenagers or even marriages, home life that leads individuals to feel like they don't belong. So the environment that people put themselves in, or in the environment that people find themselves in, the outside surroundings can actually start bringing people into a mentality of helplessness and hopelessness. The other thing is what people surround themselves with selectively when we're talking about environmental. You know, what they're watching on TV. Maybe it's not something on TV or any of those types of things. Maybe it's the fact that a friend or a relative committed suicide. That's another thing that we look at when we look at environmental impact, right? the proximity to the person. Another thing that they've mapped and studied is maybe a famous person, an actor or a singer, somebody that an individual reveres. They commit suicide, right? And so that outside influence starts impacting them, and they start seeing it that way. One thing that I want to talk about, especially with environmental factors, and it's what builds onto this idea of capacity. And we see it oftentimes in areas of high violence, high homicide rates. When death is normalized and violence is normalized, especially in the outside environment, abusive relationships, those types of things, when people experience violence on a regular basis, that propensity, that capacity, and that fearlessness actually begins to grow. And so one of the things when we look at environmental factors, the violence and the hostility that individuals experience on a regular basis will actually give them the ability to have more competency or capability. Historical factors. When we look at historical factors, we're looking at the people in our life that maybe have attempted suicide in their past. Maybe it's something that they've struggled with. They've told you that it's something that they've dealt with. Maybe it's the fact that they've had a relative or a loved one, a parent or a sibling, commit suicide. Now, suicide has not been proven to be genetic, right? But what is genetic and what is learned is coping mechanisms sometimes, propensity for coping mechanisms, what people choose to handle the stresses and the anxieties in their life. And the other thing that is genetic is mental illness. And so when we talk about history, we're talking about, when somebody commits suicide in that person's life, what were they dealing with? Was it because they had a lack of ability to cope with the stresses in their life? Was it the fact that they were dealing with mental illness? If that's the case, then those types of behaviors also were learned by this individual as well, or could have been learned by this individual as well. So it puts them at a little bit of a higher risk, okay? Mental health factors. I alluded to this a little bit at the beginning. Individuals that deal with major depression, bipolar, also called manic depression in some situations. Individuals that deal with that. Schizophrenia is another big one. Individuals that have mental conditions that have them escaping reality, or their mind having them interact with things that aren't real, leading them astray, making them feel even more hopeless and helpless. Because oftentimes, I think you know this with probably your own self, that our thoughts naturally, I think, drag us down and are self-critical. And then when our minds are broken, oftentimes that's even exasperated. And so it continues to beat individuals down, and it makes them more susceptible to these types of things. So mental health factors are extremely important. All right. Now I want to talk to you about conversations. How do you know when you're talking with somebody that they might actually be thinking that suicide might be an option for them? Some of the things that they do might be verbal cues. I don't know if I can do this anymore. I wish I just wasn't around. It'd be so much easier if I was dead. These types of things are little windows, crumbs that individuals leave behind. It gives us ideas into what they're contemplating. These types of things that individuals, I just don't know if I can do it anymore. This idea that gives you the ability to hear, okay, this person is really feeling helpless and hopeless. So they have these verbal cues. Sometimes they're not verbal cues or subtle hints at all. There's individuals out there that will just straight up tell you, you know what, I've been thinking about just ending it all. I'm done. There are individuals out there that will be just as bold as that. But to understand that when people say things, you need to take them seriously. I've always talked to people when we talk about suicide prevention awareness, and we'll get to this at the end, about our role. Words matter. And yes, there's probably been times when you could probably think back and, well, this was, I just don't know if I can do this anymore. We've been able to throw those things out at us by ourselves. And the reason is because when we go back to this thing before about mental health factors, there's not a single one of us that doesn't have mental health, right? We all have mental health. And I know for a fact that I could go down to my diagnostic manual for mental illness, and I could probably self-diagnose myself with a mental illness almost every other day. Now, the reality is being able to, what we do with our mental health, how we continue to keep a healthy mental health, and how we continue to deal and care for our mental health. And so when we look at verbal signs, we realize that, there's times when we all would say things that, might be a window or a clue or a hint into the fact that somebody might be committing suicide. But the reality is that when someone says these things, we must take it really seriously. And you're not going to make somebody suicidal by asking them. If I am in a conversation and say, I just thought about just ending it all, and someone says, hey, are you thinking about committing suicide? I'm not going to be like, I never thought about that before. That's not a thing. You're not going to make somebody more suicidal by actually double clicking or paying attention and calling attention to their words. So making sure that we understand that. Same thing with behavioral signs. When individuals all of a sudden have a dramatic and significant change in these next two items. So the first one being behavioral signs. When all of a sudden maybe they're doing high-risk things that put their life in danger that they never would have before. I've heard examples of, all of a sudden now riding their motorcycle really fast without a helmet, all of a sudden doing things where they might die that they've never done before. Now, there's a lot of individuals that are thrill seekers out there, and that's just a part of their life. That does not mean they're suicidal. I'm talking about dramatic and significant changes. You take somebody that would never have done that last year, and now all of a sudden they're doing something that puts their life in serious danger, and they're doing these things. Another thing is maybe another behavioral sign is they sleep too much, they sleep too little, they're not interested anymore. Those typical signs that you would identify as being quintessential or similar to depressive signs. Another thing that is interesting about behavioral signs, all of a sudden somebody decides they're going to start selling all their stuff. They're getting rid of all their things. They're making preparations. Maybe, and we'll get into this with the next one, mood signs. Maybe they're being over-affectionate. Maybe they're telling you that they love you a lot when they never said that before. Now, sometimes people, they just want to call you up and say that, right? But there's we're talking about significant, dramatic changes. Right? So all of a sudden, something's not right, either behaviorally or with their mood. And we all, or at least most of us have a little bit of intuition. Some of us have a lot more than others. But we can tell when we're having a conversation with individuals when something's changed and it's not right. So looking at these signs, these verbal, these behavioral, and these mood signs. So finally, let's recognize our role. What I was just saying before, right? Trust your gut. If you think something's off, address it. Just ask the question. Have the conversation. Ask how the person's doing. And actually give them the time to hear the answer. Be able to probe them. Be able to talk to them. Because like I said, this idea of suicide is preventable. These things build up over months and years. And so if you're getting clues and hints through people's verbiage, their behavior, and their moods, you are being given an opportunity to stop one person from ending their own life. Think about the risk. When somebody in front of you is doing something that just seems off and your gut is telling you something's off, think back on those risk things that we talked about. Think back all the way to their history, their environmental factors. Think back on their personal life. Think back on all these things that we listed before that might be giving them more of a propensity or more of a opportunity or a higher risk for suicide. And so if your gut is telling you something and you start thinking, you know what, John did lose his job 6 months ago, and his girlfriend broke up with him last week, and he was complaining about how he didn't have enough money to pay for his truck payment. Start looking at, and his job has been really stressful over the last year. Start looking and thinking about those risk factors. And then the last thing is the most important role. Alluded to it all before. Your most important role in suicide prevention and awareness is to simply ask the question. That's it. Like I said, you will not make somebody suicidal by asking the question. You won't make somebody suicidal by using the word suicide. Asking them will, and we'll get into our responses next week, or not next week, tomorrow, when we get into what our response actually looks like, because the reason why, and we'll talk about this tomorrow night, we need to get to the point as a community and as a people where we feel comfortable asking the question, where we're not ashamed of asking the question, and we're not afraid to ask the question, and we're not afraid of what the response or the answer might be. That's the only way we can start a road to prevention and awareness, and it's the only way we can strip the power away from suicide, and the only way we can start saving lives. So our most important role in suicide prevention and awareness is simply asking the question. All right, here is a story. This is a true life story. It's a short video of a woman, and she describes her journey of going into moments of depression, having suicidal thoughts. She's going to talk about her contemplation, how she is going to attempt to take her life, and then she'll finish the story. As she's telling the story, I know, like I said before, this has been like drinking from a fire hose, but I want you to listen to the words that she uses, and see if you can hear some of the words that she uses that have been said tonight, that would have been verbal cues and verbal clues for you, actions that would have been behavioral clues to you. Maybe think about the risks. What are some environmental risks or some personal risks? What are some historical risks that she has experienced that might make her more at risk? And start trying to analyze the situation a little bit.
So growing up, I was the youngest of 4 kids. I had 2 older sisters and an older brother, and my parents got a divorce when I was really young. When I was in 4th grade, everything kind of hit the fan. I think my mom realized everything about the divorce was kind of finalized in her mind, and she actually became an alcoholic. And I kind of took over the mom role in the house. Somebody had to stay there and make sure mom got up and make sure that bills were getting paid and make sure that things were happening in the house. And sometimes I felt that that was on my shoulders, and it was really tough. I dealt with a lot of depression. I was desperate for somebody to notice the pain that was going on inside of me. I remember one day I took a pencil in 7th grade and just started sawing into my wrist, mainly to scare the crud out of somebody next to me and get their attention. And they just kind of said, oh, she's kind of a freak, And I realized that I wanted to stop existing lots of times. I would stand up on my bed and I would stare out my window from the 2nd floor, and I would stare down at our patio, our just cement patio, and I would fantasize about just jumping out of the window. I was so afraid of it not working or hurting my family and making them feel like they didn't do a good enough job. Then it wasn't until probably college where it hit a new level of depression. Am I gonna make it through the day? It wasn't will it happen, it was when. I fell to the floor crying and just sat there and caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror and said, this is this is too pathetic. I can't just keep existing for other people. I have to just end this because nobody cares anyway. I took a walk and I took my cell phone with me and said, I'll give God a chance. I got to a bridge and I stood there and I walked up to the edge and I looked down and I thought, well, that's gonna be pretty ugly, but it's just me. They'll clean it up and move on with their days, it's fine. Stepped forward again to do it, and then my phone rang. My brother is the last person. I didn't get calls as it was, but if I were to get a call, I would never expect it to be from my brother. And then when I answered and he said, hey, I'm at your apartment, I just want to come see you, it was a whole new level, and I knew God was He was really pursuing me. He was really trying to show me something. After my brother picked me up from the bridge, I remember on the way home, my brother and his girlfriend were there. He had brought her, and she sat in the back seat, and he let her sit in the back seat, which was huge for me to have my brother ask me to sit next to him. And then he held my hand on his stick shift the whole time. He wouldn't let go of my hand, and he changed the gears with my hand on the stick shift, and he didn't want to let go of me. It was the first time in a really long time I felt like somebody saw me. I didn't feel like it was just my brother. I felt like it was God next to me, showing me, hey, I'm not going to let you go. I'm not going to let you go. I'm here, and you can't get away that easily. If I would have taken my life on that bridge almost 10 years ago, I would have missed out on my husband, Joel, the love of my life. He's the most amazing man, and God has blessed me tremendously through him. And even more blessed that our marriage, through our marriage, we were blessed with our son, Caleb. Now that I have Caleb, he shows me every day what I'm capable of through God's love.
So as I promised before, now at the end of our first session, we'll have a little bit of a grounding exercise. I'm going to introduce you guys to a little red balloon that I use on a regular basis that helps individuals with kind of recentering themselves, dealing with grounding and a little bit of self-awareness and recentering. So what I'd like you to do as we do this is we're going to begin by you guys just closing your eyes. Okay, so close your eyes, and I'd like you, as you're closing your eyes, to start thinking about what you feel. Think about where your feet are. Are they flat on the ground? Are they crossed? Think about the pressure that you feel on your feet. Maybe think about the weight that you feel in the chair that you're sitting in, your back up against that seat. Are your shoulders relaxed or are they tight? Think about what your hands are feeling. Are they feeling the cloth of your pants or the fabric of the chair? Or maybe they're folded tightly and you feel the warmth of your own fingers and hands. I like to think now about your breath. Just focus on your breath. Feel your lungs expanding and the breath going in and releasing your breath. For just a couple moments now, just focus in on that, the rhythmic breathing in and breathing out, the inhaling and the exhaling. Now I want you to envision a balloon, a red one, really shiny, the kind that you would see at a fair. I want you to envision that balloon right in front of you. I want you to think about that balloon and envision it. See, how inflated is it? How tight is the rubber? How shiny is it? Is it reflecting the light from the lights? What shade of red is it? A dark red or a light red? I want you to envision that balloon that's right in front of you. Have it start drifting upwards. Now, just a couple feet above your head. Still in front of you, but just a couple feet above your head. Now it's floated all the way to the ceiling, and it's bouncing across the top of the ceiling, or the bottom of the ceiling, I guess it would be. Now somehow it makes its way through the ceiling. It's outside. It's going all the way up, and it just continues to float, getting pushed around by the wind, and it keeps going up. Now it's 50 feet up in the air, 75 even. 200. Wow, it's really going fast, and it just continues to float higher and higher, almost as if it has nothing for it to stop. And it just keeps going up. All right, I'd like you to come on back to me. You can open your eyes. This is a little bit of red balloon. There's a couple other different ways that I use that red balloon. We'll be using it the next couple of days. Just a little bit of a mindfulness game for you, kind of pull you back out of some things if you might feel some anxiety. So now at this time, we're going to continue with any questions and answers that you guys have. We're going to go ahead and stop the video. Thank you guys upstairs. Stop the video, the live streaming, and the recording, and I can answer any questions that you have. Oh, yes. Thank you very much. See, before we go, one thing that I'd like you to do is you can get out your phone right now. This is the